Hello again. Today we're going to talk about polar experiences that were not that great. Let's begin with some stories of horror and fascination. Lovely. James Knight was an 18th century trader who worked for a Hudson-based company. The company operated out of James Bay and Hudson Bay as well, and did a lot of dealing with Canadian First Nations people from further north. As part of his work, Knight himself had quite a bit of contact with these indigenous people and had heard them tell tales of yellow metal, which James assumed to be gold, of course. Not silver, but gold. Now this intrigued James, and he decided it would be a good idea to launch an expedition into the Canadian Arctic from where the tribes hailed, to look for that gold that he assumed he would make billions off of. Although James Knight was no spring chicken, at the age of 70, like KFC co-founder, he outfitted 2 ships. He named them the Discovery and the Albany, and set off from a graveyard to explore the Canadian Arctic. However, he would not return, unfortunately. No one knew what had happened to James and his crew until 1991, when divers discovered the wrecks of James' ship at the bottom of Hudson Bay. Today, we still don't know what happened to the Arctic explorer or why it disappeared so many years ago, but we try to assume the best. John Franklin was an Englishman who entered the Royal Navy at the ripe young age of 14. You go, boy. During this time in the Navy, he was part of several expeditions and eventually became fascinated with the Arctic. Chilly, or cool, like the Batman movie. He even attempted to expedition in 1818 to reach the North Pole. Sadly for John, however, this love of the Arctic would turn out to be ill-fated. In 1845, Franklin decided to launch an expedition to find the Northwest Passage through Canada. At first, the expedition seemed to be going well, and then the crew stopped in Greenland and stocked up for supplies just a few months after leaving England. That, however, would be the last anyone ever saw of them, unfortunately. After departing Greenland, the expedition was neither heard nor seen again. The British Navy set apart trying to find Franklin and his 160-man crew and launched the biggest naval search in Britain to date. However, they didn't find anything until 170 years later, when the shipwreck of Franklin's boats, the Terrier and the Epirus, were found in Canadian Arctic waters. How unfortunate. Of course. Edward von Toll was born in Eston in 1858, and from an early age took a liking to the sciences. He went on to study mineralogy, zoology. How fun and exciting. I'm sure in the 4th grade you wanted to learn that. And medicine university, and even went off to a research expedition in the Baltic Isles. It seems that this was the first expedition got him inspired because in 1900, Edward took off on a Russian polar expedition to hunt on an island called Sudnogov Land. I apologize if I butchered that, I'm sure I did. While on this expedition, Edward was set to study geology and geography, and he couldn't have been more excited. Of course, who loves geology more than Edward? And things couldn't have been more exciting, or to be a smooth start to say the least. Incredibly hard winters and hard to spend 2 seasons in the new Siberian agriculture or the winter itself to wait for the weather to clear. All this waiting left Edward impatient, however, so he took off with the sled and kayak to continue with his search on his own. Of course, this was a terrible idea. That was the last of the rest of the party ever saw of Edward. And despite 2 search parties being launched in 1903, no trace of Edward was ever found, unfortunately. Edward was also seen in twilight. Robert Falcon Scott was a captain in the British Royal Navy, and like many others before him, was determined to find the South Pole. Not the North Pole with Santa Claus, but the South. He led one initial expedition in 1901, which was highly successful. That led him to make a second attempt in 1912, the good old year of Titanic. This second attempt, however, didn't go quite so well. While in the second attempt to the South Pole, Robert had a communication hiccup, where his base camp failed to send a dog team out to him when he needed them most. Stranded with no rescue and no supplies, Scott and his companions set up camp, of course. Eventually, they wasted away due to the harsh conditions, unfortunately. A recovery team later discovered Scott and his remains, including his team members, frozen to death in their tent. They also discovered Antarctic fossils with them, which were a huge discovery at the time, since they provided proof that Antarctica had once been laden with greenery and living things, like any parts of the world as well. Good job. Vladimir Rusevov was a Russian explorer, of course with that name, who began his career leading expeditions back in 1909. On this expedition, he headed out to Nova Zemlya, and it seems that his expedition was a successful one because the Russian government assigned him another expedition in 1912 to head to the South Pole. Vladimir set sail from what's now Belgrave in Russia on June 26, 1912, to start his expedition. I'm very sorry that I butchered that. The crew had a successful summer on fieldwork and sent 3 of their team members back to Russia to report their findings. The other 10 members of the party, however, set sail again, this team for the Pacific Ocean instead. The second expedition didn't go as planned, of course, just like a sitcom. And after their departure, it went bad to worse. They were never seen again, which is the worst part. The last to be heard of them was when they sent a telegram in 1912 outlining their plans. But after that, the crew was lost forever. Unfortunate, of course. Hugh willingly was an intrepid Englishman and a member of the British Royal Navy. Way back in the 16th century, in 1553, Vladimir set off on a naval expedition at the command of a man named Sebastian Cabot. As with many other English-led expeditions, the goal of the adventure was to find the Northeast Passage through the Arctic, as we all do when we're waking up on a Wednesday morning. As part of the expedition, Williamsborough was given 3 ships, which were to help him find the fabled passage. However, in August of 1553, a nasty storm hit the vessel, and the fleet of the ships became separated from one another. One of the ships managed to make into the White Sea, but the other ships and the crews were lost, never to be seen or heard from again, unfortunately. George Washington Delon was an American explorer born in none other than New York City. New York, although he would lead many expeditions, his most ill-fated was certainly one he launched in 1881, to the Arctic, of course. What makes the expedition different from the others, it was led from the US Navy. Delon was determined to reach the North Pole. He wanted to see Santa Claus, of course. He set sail in 1879 from San Francisco on the USS Jeannette, heading through the Bering Strait and up near northern Siberia. While sailing these waters, however, Delon became trapped in pack ice. Although Delon and his crew managed to make it off the boat with their provisions and several lifeboats, this would not prove to be enough. Their destination was more than 600 meters, or 965 kilometers, away from what they needed to be from. Although they tried to sail their way further north, the lifeboats became separated and were lost. Delon is said to have died of exposure and starvation, while several of his other men were lost at sea, never to be seen again, maybe by sharks they were seen or penguins, unfortunately. Gregory Bernsvich was a Russian explorer who set off in 1912, charted a map between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. The idea was to create a route called the Northern Sea Route. Sadly, however, the boat was trapped in the ice pretty quickly, and the crew was forced to spend the winter waiting for the ice to thaw like ice cream. By the time the summer rolled around, however, the boat was still stuck and Gregory had become quite sick. In an attempt to save his captain, several crew members ditched the ship, tried to make their way back home by walking south over the drifting ice. Sounds like a good plan. I wish they had Uber. This plan didn't go well as expected, of course. However, Gregory, along with many other crew members, went missing somewhere along the way. Although Gregory, his ship, and his crew were never found years later, in 2010, explorers managed to find a few crew members' belongings. Including in these belongings was a logbook, which detailed just what happened to the ill-fated crew. Maybe I'll detail that in another video. Let me know in the comments below. Like and subscribe. Belgrave Edward Nintz wasn't an expedition leader. Instead, he was just an expedition member on the Australian Antarctica. Expedition the Experience was launched in 1911 from Australia, down under, with the goal of exploring the Antarctic coast, which lies just to the south of the island nation. The expedition was largely a success and lasted a total of 3 years. During the expedition, explorers put up a communication system between Australia and Antarctica. However, there was one hiccup that married them to the most of the expedition: the disappearance of Belgrave Edward Nintz. During the crew's exploration of the Antarctica, poor Edward fell into an ice cavern and plummeted into the abyss. Despite rescue attempts to get him back out, he was never seen again, unfortunately. I'm very curious of what you would do in a situation where you fell in a crevice. I would freak out and cry and keep digging like Minecraft. While most Antarctic expeditions are led by boat, one particular explorer named S.A. Andra decided to think outside the box and attempt to explore the North Pole by a different mode of transportation, a hot air balloon. Now, as you can probably imagine, that this was a terrible idea. The whole expedition got off to a rough start when the polar balloon arrived in Sweden, where S.A. Andra and his crew were set to take off, untested. On top of that, the balloon was shown to be leaking. None of that to stop the Andra. However, in 1897, he and his two co-pilots set off from Svalbard, probably butchered that, to explore the Arctic. 2 days later, however, the balloon lost hydrogen and crashed into the ice pack below. Despite being unhurt, the explorers found themselves trapped into the Arctic with no supplies and no support. They wound up stranded in the cold and deserted island of the Arctic. No one heard or saw from them again until 1930, when a chance discovery turned up the remnants of the crew last camp, and the mysterious disappearance was laid to rest at last. Unfortunate, of course. What do you think of these Arctic explorers? If you were back in the old ages of time itself, where would you explore? I'd probably do a warmer climate, probably Florida or Bermuda, not necessarily the Antarctica, but all good itself. Antarctica is awesome as well. I love polar bears and penguins. Who doesn't love Ice Age, the movie? Anyway, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.